Bible John. Bible John is the name of a still-at-large, never-apprehended serial killer from Glasgow. In the late 60s, he killed 3 women on 3 separate occasions, all of whom he met at the Barrowlands dance hall. Bible John's MO was simple. He would meet up with a female, dance and chat with them, often reciting passages of scripture. He would then proceed to leave the Barrowlands with his victim. Then, while out in the street, Bible John would then murder the woman via strangulation. The first victim was a nurse called Patricia Docker. She was killed in 1968, with her body being discovered near a garage just a few feet from her home. Well over a year later, Bible John claimed his second victim, a woman in her 30s called Jemima MacDonald. She was killed in a similar fashion to Patricia Docker. Her body was discovered a few days later in an abandoned building. The last confirmed murder attributed to Bible John was of Helen Puttock. Her body was discovered in the back garden, again just a few feet from her home. It was after this murder that the press discovered the name of John, leading to Bible John's infamous moniker. According to witnesses, they saw all the victims in the company of a man who all shared a similar description. That, along with the particular detail of his habit of quoting Bible scriptures. Even though many detectives attended the Barrowlands dance hall undercover and even released a composite drawing of the suspect, no one was arrested. Despite this, however, Bible John actually never struck again. No other killings have been attributed to him, leading to many theories as to why. Some believe he simply moved away or fled the country to avoid prosecution. Others believe he was arrested for a completely unrelated case and sent to prison. However, there's been recent news articles that suggest Bible John was actually protected by police. Druids. Having first been acknowledged by none other than Julius Caesar way back in the 1st century, it's fair to say Druids have been around for a while. Not much is known about them, as they never kept any records themselves, but it is believed that they came from Gaul, present-day France, and spread throughout Europe with a considerable number settling in Scotland. They were essentially Celtic magicians, but also fulfilled the roles of diplomats, priests, advisors, astronomers, and doctors to numerous early Scottish clans. They placed heavy emphasis and faith on nature itself and regularly used herbal concoctions. While most of their practices were benign, one thing they did do was live sacrifices. They primarily used animals for this, but did also use humans, willing or unwilling. They were also heavily associated with paganism, which caused issues with the arrival of Christianity to Scotland, as well as general suppression by the Romans. Eventually, Druids lost their influence and position with the people and had to go underground to avoid persecution. However, with the passing of centuries and as society in general became more tolerant of different groups and fraternities, the 1960s saw a more modern return of Druids. Today they maintain gatherings at Stonehenge, as they did in the past. They also seem to be more involved with environmental matters and have ceased human sacrifices. Allegedly. The Fairy Dog. Scotland is well known for its mythical folklore animals and beasts. Obviously the best known is Nessie, who is believed to dwell in the depths of Loch Ness. However, a lesser known creature that is said to roam the Scottish Highlands in densely thick forests, the dog fairy, Cooshie. Cooshie is described as a dog-like beast about the size of a cow with long dark green hair. It is also said to possess magical properties and has access to some sort of spirit realm. Despite its size, it is an extremely quick and stealthy hunter, making its home mostly in clefts and caves, venturing out into forests and onto moors in search of prey, either alone or part of a pack. According to legend, the Kushi would let out a terrifying howl 3 times into the night. Anyone unfortunate enough to hear the first howl would only have a limited time to run and seek safety. If said person did not do so and heard the third howl, it would mean certain death, either due to complete fear or by the Kushi finding the person and tearing their very soul from their body. Of course, there have been many alleged sightings of the Kushi for over 400 years all around Scotland and Ireland. However, none have been confirmed. The missing lighthouse keepers. To the west of the Scottish mainland are a collection of small islands known as the Flannan Isles. The largest of these islands is called Elaine Moor. In 1900, there were 2 man-made structures on the island, a small stone bothy and a lighthouse. The lighthouse was manned by 3 keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. All 3 disappeared in December of that same year. A steamer ship travelling from America to Scotland sailed past Elaine Moor and noticed that the lighthouse was not operating. After arriving at its destination, the crew of the steamer made a report to the Northern Lighthouse Board, and a vessel called Hesperus 1 was sent to investigate. After blowing the ship's whistle and lighting a flare but still not getting a response, one crew member went ashore to physically investigate. After an extensive search of the entire lighthouse and the island itself, there was still no sign of the keepers. They simply vanished. Many theories have been put forth as to the fate of the keepers, ranging from the highly plausible to the ridiculously absurd. But one sinister theory that persists is that one of the keepers was struggling with cabin fever, and one day he just completely snapped. While his colleagues went for a stroll around the island, he chased after them and killed them both before ending his own life. It's been over a century since the disappearance of the keepers, and no conclusive explanation has been provided as to what happened to them. Their bodies were never found, no evidence of foul play within the lighthouse or signs of anyone visiting the island beforehand. It's a mystery that will probably never be solved. Starvation cult. In 1999, a 49-year-old woman called Verity Lynn was found dead 100 yards away from her tent on the shores of Loch Cam. While on the surface there was no evidence of foul play, when a post-mortem was conducted, it was revealed she died of hypothermia and extreme dehydration, along with a lack of nutrition. It turns out Verity was associated with a sinister quasi-cult known as breatharianism. Breatharianism is the belief that humans can survive without food or water, and that nourishment can be obtained through fresh air and sunlight. One of the most prominent advocates for this movement is an Australian woman known as Jasmuheen, real name Ellen Grieve, who claims she could live without food and water for years. She wrote several books on the subject, including Living on Light, a copy of which was found among Verity Lynn's possessions. It turns out Verity was a follower of Jasmuheen and had planned to go on a 21-day fasting program. Unfortunately, this was not an isolated incident. Other deaths have been attributed to Jasmuheen and breatharianism. What is perhaps even more concerning is that top-tier celebrities have also been involved in this movement. One example being Michelle Pfeiffer. The Well of the Seven Heads. In 1663, Two brothers named Alexander and Ranald were stabbed to death after a very rowdy night of feasting and drinking. The person responsible was a relative of the brothers called Alexander MacDonald, along with his 6 sons. Despite the brazen nature of the crime, MacDonald and his family pretty much received no reprisals for their actions. This angered a local Gaelic poet called Ian Lom, who was friends with the slain brothers. He refused to let the murders go unpunished, and so embarked on what was a 2-year campaign to avenge his friends. Lom tried appealing to the locals for help, but they refused to get involved. He then approached various clan chiefs, but got the same result. It seems that everyone in the local area were either allies or afraid of MacDonald and his family. He eventually managed to get the attention of Sir James of Duntullum Castle, based in Skye. This led to the involvement of the Privy Council of Edinburgh, who issued letters of execution against MacDonald by fire and sword, effectively giving Ian Lom a free pass to hunt down the men responsible for killing the brothers. Lom then led a group of about 50 men to the home of MacDonald. He then proceeded to slaughter him and his 6 sons, then removed their heads. Decapitation was a very common form of execution in Scotland, something that was a plot point in the film Highlander. Ian Lom, satisfied that after 2 years justice had finally been carried out. He took the 7 heads as a trophy. Then, when passing through Invergary, he approached a local well, then proceeded to clean the heads of blood. In 1812, a statue was built directly above the well that Lom used. On its top is a sculpture of the 7 heads being held by the fist of Ian Lom. Henry John Burnett. Margaret May was a recently separated woman of 2 kids, her marriage to Thomas Guyon having broken down due to infidelity. Not long after starting a new job, Margaret soon started a new relationship with a young man in his early 20s called Henry John Burnett. This new romance soon blossomed, and Margaret, along with one of her sons, eventually moved in with Burnett. However, unbeknownst to Margaret, Burnett was an extremely troubled man. He suffered badly from paranoia and was believed to be schizophrenic. Burnett was terrified that Margaret would eventually leave him, as she did with her husband, and so Burnett began locking Margaret in the house whenever he wasn't there. Ironically, this behaviour actually drove Margaret to seek a reconciliation with her estranged husband. Accompanied by her friend Georgina, Margaret confronted Burnett and stated her intention to leave him. But Burnett threatened her with a knife, stating she was not going to leave him. It was only after interference from Georgina that Burnett let Margaret go and he fled the scene. Margaret immediately returned to her estranged husband, while Burnett ran to his brother's house and stole his shotgun. He then proceeded to the Guyon's home. Burnett forced his way in and found Thomas Guyon and shot him in the face, killing him instantly. Burnett then kidnapped Margaret at gunpoint, and they both made their way to the street where they hijacked a car. However, the couple were soon caught up with by police, and Burnett was immediately arrested. He was tried and found guilty of the murder of Thomas Guyon. Despite a plea of insanity and requests for leniency, Henry John Burnett was sentenced to death by hanging. A crowd of more than 200 people gathered outside Craiginch's prison in Aberdeen to witness the execution. Burnett became the last man to receive the death penalty in Scotland. Just 2 years later, capital punishment was suspended and later abolished in the entire UK. Pirate Graveyard. In the Black Isle area of Scotland, there is a small seaport town called Cromarty. On a hilltop opposite the servants' tunnel to Cromarty House, is the St. Regulus Graveyard, or as the locals call it, the Pirates' Graveyard. Constructed more than 3 centuries ago, this resting place for the dead actually does not have any pirates buried here. It gained its unofficial name of Pirates' Graveyard mainly due to the number of slabs and headstones that have memento mori imagery, motifs that represent the passage of time and the inevitability of death. Various skull and crossbones carved in stone, making it look very eerie. It is a very unusual sight, considering traditional gravestones don't have such imagery. But it all serves as a timely reminder that regardless of whatever bullshit happens in life, eventually, we all end up in the same place. The Ninth Legion. There is no denying the cultural, political, and societal impact the Roman Empire has had on the world. At its height, the empire controlled all of the Mediterranean and the majority of the European continent. Yet there was one country it wasn't able to subdue. Despite various invasions, Rome never managed to fully conquer Scotland, or Caledonia as they called it. The Romans invaded Britain in 19 AD, and one of the legions involved was the elite and battle-hardened Legio IX Hispana, or simply the Ninth Legion. The Ninth Legion had previously been involved in numerous battles throughout Europe and were considered very experienced. While in Britain, they were used to put down rebellions and engaged in smaller battles to mixed success. But what is suspicious is that after 108 AD, any records, texts, and inscriptions of the Ninth Legion simply stopped, and the legion itself vanished. This was very unusual, since the Romans were very meticulous in documenting their conquests as well as their losses. To have an entire legion disappear without any explanation or reason is very odd. It is speculated that the Ninth Legion, who were last based in York, was sent to Caledonia to handle a revolt, and were systematically wiped out by Celtic warriors who inhabited the area. The Celts were considered violent barbarians, and particularly ruthless on the battlefield. However, this is still only a theory. Nobody truly knows what happened to the Ninth Legion. The Rosangle House Murders. On a warm day in May 1980, a small group of med students were playing football on the streets of Dundee, when the ball was accidentally kicked into the garden of a nearby house called Rosangle. One of the students hopped the fence to retrieve it. After making a cursory glance at a basement window that had been smashed, he saw a horrific sight. 2 bodies, hacked and beaten to death. The victims were an elderly couple, retired Dr. Alexander Wood and his wife Dorothy. The man responsible was called Henry Gallagher. Roughly several days before the med student's gruesome discovery, Gallagher had broken into the address of 2 Rosangle House with the intention of robbing the place. He smashed the basement window, which caught the attention of Dorothy, who went to investigate, followed by Alexander. Gallagher proceeded to attack them both, while the elderly couple tried in vain to defend themselves. Eventually, Gallagher reached for a Slater's hammer and bludgeoned the pair. Then, for some strange, macabre reason, Gallagher then propped up the battered bodies into chairs in the basement kitchen. He then robbed the house of anything of value and fled the city for the English border. However, this was not the end of Gallagher's killing spree. Upon arriving in Ramsgate, he visited a monk called Edward Hull and confessed to what he did at Rosangle. Gallagher eventually murdered the monk along with his housekeeper. He was eventually apprehended 7 days later. He pled guilty to the 2 later murders and was sent to Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital, where he supposedly remains to this day. In a book of short stories called Blind Rage, which was published in 1994, Gallagher, under a pen name, confessed to what happened at Rosangle. but despite this, he has never been charged for the murders at Roseangle House. Scale House. To the north of the Scottish mainland is the island of Orkney. In the area of Sandwich is a building called Scale House. It was constructed in 1620 and was partially built on an ancient burial ground. Sound familiar? Anyways, this probably explains why there have been numerous reports of supernatural activity taking place in and around the property. One laird who owned the place once reported that late at night, when he was just about to fall asleep, he heard footsteps beyond his bedroom door. He knew he wasn't dreaming or hallucinating because his dog began barking hysterically after hearing them as well. The property itself allegedly has 2 resident ghosts, one called Ubi, who occupies a certain area of the house, and the ghost of an unknown woman in a shawl who was sighted in the courtyard. There's also been reports of doors opening and closing on their own, as well as particularly cold spots throughout the house. Again, sound familiar? In the 1990s, the house became open to the public. Today, it is used for private functions as well as a guest house. The Last Witch. When asked about witch trials, people usually think back to those that happened at Salem in the 1690s. Very few will recall that Scotland had its own fair share of witch trials, which led to the execution of roughly 4,000 people. The last of which took place in 1727, and it involved a woman allegedly named Janet Horne. Her real name has never been confirmed. Janet worked as a maid and had been living in the small town of Dornoch with her daughter. Local residents were very suspicious of Janet, mainly due to her daughter, who was born with physically deformed hands and feet. They believed Janet was a witch and had been attempting to turn her own daughter into a pony for the devil. Janet was also believed to have suffered from dementia. It was because of these things that Janet was accused of witchcraft, which led to her arrest. After a quick trial, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was covered in tar and led down through the streets of Dornoch to an area called Littletown, then burned alive. Due to her dementia, it is said that Janet didn't truly understand what was going on and was actually smiling moments before her death. There was a stone placed at the site of where Janet was executed, with the incorrect year emblazoned upon it. It remains there to this day. Janet Horne was the last person to be executed for being a witch. The Maya Breza sinking. Mali Breza was a French destroyer warship that was in service during World War II. In 1940, it was anchored in the Scottish town of Greenock, receiving maintenance before its next operation. Just after 2 p.m, a malfunction occurred which resulted in the launch of a torpedo onto the ship's deck. It exploded and immediately killed 6 crew members while injuring numerous others. The explosion caused severe damage to the ship's deck and ignited the fuel tanks, causing a fire. Although most of the crew members managed to escape with injuries, a more terrifying fate awaited those below deck. Not too dissimilar to the Titan submarine implosion incident, there were some who were trapped in the ship's mess hall. As the fire spread and the ship slowly began to sink, Rescuers watched in horror through the portholes as the trapped crew members screamed and pleaded for help. Medics from the nearby ship HMS Furious began to hand out massive doses of morphine to the trapped men through the portholes, perhaps knowing there was no chance of rescue. 21 people lost their lives, either by drowning or being burnt alive. An unofficial memorial was built on Lyle Hill dedicated to those who lost their lives. A few years later, in 1954, the ship was eventually recovered and dismantled.